Okay, good morning. Good morning. So they will, because Yud Shvat is the Shabbos, Shivim Shana, 70 years from when the Rebbe first said the first Basi L'Gani Tafshin Yud Aleph. So we'll move from Mayin Beis to Basi L'Gani. Obviously, all of Chassidus is connected, as you shall see. And we'll go over it. So the Rebbe, as we know, said the Maimer and that Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud Aleph. And obviously the Chiddush was the first Maimer the Rebbe ever said. It was a surprise for almost everybody. And then subsequently every year after that, the Rebbe said Basi L'Gani every Yud Shvat, but then began with the Prokim, meaning each year corresponded, as explained, primarily one Peirik going in order. There's 20 Prokim in the Hemshech. It's 4 Maimorim. Each Maimer consists of 5 Prokim. So the 20 Prokim. So the Rebbe went through Tafshid Beis was Peirik Beis, Tafshid Gimel Peirik Gimel, and so on. When it came to Tafshin Lamed, it was Peirik Chof. So Lamed Aleph, nobody knew what would happen. So the Rebbe began again, Lamed Aleph, starting from Peirik Aleph. Then went again Lamed Beis, and so went till basically Mem Ches, I think, is the last Basi L'Gani. So the Rebbe didn't finish actually the second cycle completely. It went till Peirik Yud Ches. After that, the Rebbe wasn't saying Maimorim anymore. But Kemuvan, Chassidim continued with the same Seder. That every year, learning the Basi L'Gani, especially the Peirik that corresponds. So this year is the 4th cycle, Peirik Yud Aleph, Tavshin Pei Aleph. Okay, so we have, besides obviously Peirik Yud Aleph from the Friedrich Rebbe, we have the Rebbe's Maimorim that he said, Tavshin Chof Aleph, and again in Tavshin Mem Aleph. Tavshin Chof Aleph, Yud Shvat was Shabbos, which was, by the way, just as it was during the Shnasei Stalkus.
Friday?
Shabbos.
Yud Shvat that year was on Friday.
Yud Shvat was Friday?
Yeah, Yud Aleph.
Oh, Yud Aleph Shvat was Shabbos, okay, good. So Yud Aleph Shvat was Shabbos, so the Rebbe said a Maimer Erev Shabbos, before Kagav, the middle of Ma'ariv before Kagavna. And then again, Mitzvah Shabbos was a Fabringen. By day, it was Pasha B'Shalach. And the Rebbe said, Vahi B'Shalach, where he talks about some of the Inyanim in the Maimer. And what I'll try to do is, because we don't have, it would take hours to really learn the Maimer properly. Chof Aleph Maimer, especially the 2 Maimorim, there's Shinuyim, there's plenty of differences. And especially with the B'Shalach, it has more stuff in it. And Mem Aleph is Nacha Maimer. So what I'll try to do, since I'm sure you all learned the Pshuta Shel Mikra, so to speak, the Maimer itself, try to go a little more in depth and analyze and to understand the Teichanat Vorim. And there's a lot. This is a very deep Maimer Tavshin Chalef Aleph. It's one of the more complex Maimorim from the Rebbe. So I'll try to connect it all, and obviously with the central theme of Basi L'Gani. So we'll do that. Okay. Just for the record, L'chvevusa de Milsa, later years we discovered Rabbi Moshe Groner, Olav Shalom, told the story that he went to see the Rebbe the night before Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud Aleph. He had to go for some reason. The Rebbe sent him to do something, so he came to the Rebbe's house, New York Avenue. The Rebbe was living on New York Avenue and President, right here, a corner from a block away from here. And when he came to the Rebbe's house, apartment, he saw that the Rebbe on the table was maybe 20, 30 Sfarim open. And it was clear that the Rebbe was preparing something. The night before Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud Aleph. Leil Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud Aleph. So he was clear that the Rebbe was going to say something. All the Sfarim were open. Obviously, the Rebbe probably had Sfarim open all the time. But here it was clearly, I think when I recall when he said it, he did say that Basi L'Gani was also open. The Basi L'Gani was also open. I don't recall that, if you knew exactly what's for him. It was the Eitz Chaim, he said, and I think a lot of us Sifrei Chassidus. Now, it makes total sense, because if you look at the Maimer Basi L'Gani Tavshin Yud Aleph, you can see that the Rebbe, like in all the Maimorim, brings all the Rabbeim. And just as you probably know also, that the Rebbe would give out B'Ksav Yad every year, I believe almost every year, a type of what's called kavanoki, or like he would give the maimorim of each Rebbe that he would be quoting in the Basi L'Gani. So when we made the Hanochas, we always had from the Rebbe, besides speaking it, he actually gave the Maramokim, like Admur Azokin here, the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, the Admur Azokin, and all the way down to the Rebbe Rashab. In later years, the Rebbe added also his father. So basically, every Basi L'Gani you'll see goes in that order, from the Baal Shem Tov all the way to the Rebbe Rashab, and later years also from Kutlev Yitzchak or Teres Levi. Which makes total sense, because this is the Maimer Hanasiyas, so the Rebbe in a sense is bringing together all the Rabbeim. As you know, Basi L'Gani Yudalev, they also sang the Nigunim. The Rebbe was mafsik between the sections of the Maimer, and they sang the Nigunim of each Rebbe going in that order. Okay, so let's go straight to the topic at hand. And so Perek Yud Aleph is the beginning of the third Maimer in Basi L'Gani, the Hemshech. I said 5 prakim, 5 prakim, 5 prakim, and then 5 prakim. Just again, the way they came out then was that Shabbos Pasha Boy Yud Shvat Tovshin Yud, the Rebbe was giving out kuntresim almost every week. I don't know if every week, but a kuntres would include a maimer and some siches or menhagim and a letter or two. You have the kuntresim. Now they're all printed together in the Sefer Maimorim, but you have Teif Maimorim Tovshin Tes or Tovshin Yud. So these kuntresim, that's why the Rebbe each week would also have footnotes. The Rebbe would prepare these kuntresim with footnotes. So of course that Friday they came out the kuntres, and that stalkus was that Shabbos morning. The Rebbe read many Ramozim. If you look in the Pesach Dover, the original Pesach Dover of that Basi L'Gani, you'll see the Shlit is missing the Yud. The kinds of different strange things that were connected to that Maimer when it came out. The Yud and Shalita was missing in the Pesach Dover Tovshin Yud. But the other kuntresim came out after the Istalkos. That's why you look at the Akdomas to each of the kuntresim of the basically 2 kuntresim, Purim and Beis Nissen was the last one, I think. Yeah, so there you see the Rebbe is already referring to Friedrich Rebbe as after the Istalkos. So no one knew the Hemshech itself, in other words, came out after besides the first 5 prakim came out afterwards. The truth is, Basi L'Gani is really the Hemshech HaMaimorim from the Friedrich Rebbe in Tafresh Pei Gimel. It's word for word from Tafresh Pei Gimel. There, the Hemshech is not called Basi L'Gani; it's called Vahi Be'etzem Hayem Hazeh. I'm saying it intentionally because you'll see in a minute why it's negay. Some say that the Rebbe, the first time the Rebbe came to see the Friedrich Rebbe, the first time he saw the Friedrich Rebbe was Pei Gimel. So it could very well be that was the first Maimorim that Rebbe heard. Our Rebbe heard from the Friedrich Rebbe. So Pizem Yeshleimer, maybe, remember these kuntresim were printed later, it was not new Maimorim, it was Maimorim from early years. So it's interesting, the first time the Rebbe saw the Friedrich Rebbe, that became the Basi L'Gani, that now for the Rebbe started his Nesiyas with, and is what we continue learning every Yud Shvat. Which explains one of the pillars that people wonder why, if you look in Perek Yud, suddenly the Friedrich Rebbe starts and said, this is the beer why it says, Vahi Be'etzem Hayem Hazeh, Tzivus Hashem. Nowhere in the Hemshech is it mentioned before. If you look from Basi L'Gani, the first 9 prakim, there's no mention of Tzivus Hashem altogether. And this becomes now the Yisod of Perek Yud Aleph and the Hemshech of the Maimorim all the way till the end. The reason, technically, I'm talking about like why suddenly be Tzivus Hashem? Because this was a Maimer that was said on Parsha Boy, that's the pasuk, and the Maimer began Vayi Be'etzem Hayem Hazeh. The Rebbe took out that Dibra Maschel when they printed it, and it became a Hemshech from Basi L'Gani. Just a little context so we understand. This doesn't Chaz v'Shalom in any way diminish the relevance of Tzivus Hashem. It's not Tzugish Shepet, because it's negated to the whole Teichin Advarim. So basically, to understand Perek Yud Aleph well, and understand the Rebbe's Maimer on Perek Yud Aleph, both the Chaf Aleph and Mem Aleph, it's good to understand the flow. So let's talk about the flow a moment. So B'kitzur Nimnitz, Basi L'Gani starts, we knows with the Medrash Shir Shirim Rabbah, that explains essentially Tachlis Habriya, that in the beginning Ikar Shechina B'Tachteni, Heisa L'Gani, Eksiv L'Gnuni, that this was Ikar Shechina B'Tachteni, the Gnuni is the bridal chamber, meaning the Eibishter this was his domain. Existence on this earth, that's where the Shechina was there. The Chet Adam caused the Shechina to be Nistalik, which means Nisalim, that the Shechina would be concealed, And then the subsequent generations of Mor Chatoim essentially disconnected the Gili, disconnected existence from its purpose, from Elikus. And then the Medrash continues, the process was reversed, starting with Avram Avinu, that he began to be Mamshechit from Rekiah Shvi to Rekiah Shishi, all the way to Deir Shvi, Moshe Rabbeinu, who brought back the Shekhinah Lamata. In other words, as it was before Chet Tzadas. So essentially, Matan Torah, and then the Mishkan returned existence to the way it was in the beginning, Tchilas Habriyah. However, even though it doesn't talk about it in the Maimer, we know that the Chet Egel, and then Mashiach didn't come then. Because the pastors that would have been, the Geula should come. So Ilu Zachu, Taka would have happened, but it didn't happen. So the rest of Aveda Sa'odam, from the time of then, from after Yitzis Mitzrayim and Matan Torah and Binyan HaMishkan, till this day, is the Aveda of being made of the Shekhinah Lamata. And as the Rebbe said in that first Maimer 70 years ago, that today we are the seventh generation from the Alter Rebbe. And that's the Hemshech HaDvar. Poshet that the Aveda continues. And we will finish the job that began all the way back then. And just as Moshe was made of the Shekhinah of Shechanti B'Seicham, which even though the Mishkan was no longer here and the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, but the Inyan, the Sinas Keach for Aveda Sa'odam, to bring the Shekhinah, that was achieved. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Perek Lamed Vav, Kfar Hoya Me'enza B'Matan Torah. Kfar Hoya Le'elam Me'enza B'Matan Torah. So in other words, Matan Torah and the Mishkan did not just end. It gave the Keach for the rest of Aveda till Deirenu. And the Rebbe calls our generation Deir Ashvi, Deir Achron of Golas, Deir Rishon of Geula, that our job is to finish that process, Meir Zayin the Shechina, and this time permanently. Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi is Abayis Nitzchi. So no longer is it just L'fisha, it's permanent, L'elam Vod, Mishkan Adnei Ken Yedecha. That's the context of the Hemshech, which you could see from what I just said, why it's so central, because essentially establishes, number one, the purpose of our generation, which means us right here. And number two, it puts it in historical context from the beginning of time, from Yisraelim, Gan Eden, through Matan Torah, through Mishkan, all the way through Yimei HaGolos till today. That's the central, if you want to sum up the overall Basi L'Gani, from Perek Aleph to Perek Chaf, the whole Perek. So it's interesting that this became the Maimer, Ashgacha Prat, is that the Rebbe launched his Nesias with, and would be the Maimer, the central, foundational Maimer of every Basi L'Gani, every Yud Shvat. Okay, but to break down the details, so we know the first 10 parakim basically, again, B'Kitzur, talks about what is Rishachanti B'Seichel. It analyzes how do you make Rishachanti B'Seichel. So we look at the Mishkan again. We look at the Vedas HaKarbonis, Odom Kiyakir Mikem, explains that at length. How we take, and then the Mishkan itself is made Aseh Shittim, that becomes a central theme, Shittim, from the word Shtus the L'umazeh, to transform that to Shtus the Kedusha. That's how we make a Mishkan in Avedas Adam, which essentially is the tools of how we bring the Shekhinah back. So each year the Rebbe obviously explained each one of these parakim. Then at the end of Perek Yud, which leads into our Perek, to Dan, Perek Yud, he goes into Tzivus Hashem. And who does this Aveda? Till now he didn't really discuss, he talked about the Aveda itself, but who fulfills it? Who's the Gavra, so to speak, that implements this? That's the Bnei Neshamas Yisrael that are called Tzivus Hashem, Tzivus Havaya. And here begins the explanation of Tzivus. In Perek Yud, he says there's three interpretations in the word Tzivus, or Tzvais, from the word Chayil, which is Pirush HaPoshet, soldier, from the word Tzivian, beauty, like Al Tzivom, V'chol HaShamayim V'arz V'chol Tzivom, and the third Pirush is from the word Zman Mugbal, a limited time. In Perek Yud, interestingly, he only explains the second two. In Perek Yud Aleph, it goes now back to the main Pirush, from the word Chayil, Chayolim. So, and here he introduces really the concept of a war. This is the first time the Hemshech starts talking about a Malchama. Now, obviously, the Malchama here is a Malchama Ruchnius, but it makes total sense because when you have to transform Shtus the Klippah to Shtus the Kedusha, that doesn't come easily. As Yoda Inish Benafshe. Just look at when you're, It's one thing when you have al pitam v'dasa taiva is one thing, but if it comes a shtuz de lumazeh, you need a mochama. Lashon Tanya, it's a mochama between the nefesh l'kis and nefesh habamis. So mochama now is a vital component in this whole hemshech. So Perek Yud Aleph talks about this mochama and states the following: so why did Eden call tzivus havaya? And what I'm saying here is, I'll refer to some of them in my mother, but as I said, because of time, I think it's easier. So I start reading the lines. You can do that yourself. I'll put it more in the context, and then you see the pratim. It really becomes, I think, very reich. So he asked the question: why is it called tzivus havaya? Friedrich Rebbe asks. I'll distinguish when I'll start getting when the Rebbe starts explaining it all. So why is it called tzivus? The chayre, as the Rebbe explains, it should have been called havaya. The chiddush of Yetzias Mitzrayim was havaya. The Eibishter says in the beginning of Parsha Ve'era, Shmi havaya leina daitilem, but to you I will be Megal Hashem havaya. The name Tzvois is already a lower name. Even Tzivus Havaya, Tzvois Havaya is not Havaya Mamash. So why the name Tzvois? So the answer, B'kitzur, is because the Choma, Tzvois is connected to Mochama. Like he brings from the Medrash, Lefi Maisi Ani Nikra, that the Eibishter obviously is L'mayla M'kol Shemus, and the Eibishter is L'mayla M'kol Toyarim, and descriptions and definitions. But Lefi Maisi, since I do different actions, so when I leichem im rishoyim in Elam Hazeh, that's when I call it tzvois. That's what the Medrash says. And then he brings from Rabbi Yesli Giktelaya from Shari Eira that the name tzvois is in Netzach and Heid, because that's connected to that. Leichem kol ha-milchamas comes from that. So every time there's a war, doesn't even say which. Just kol ha-milchamas. That's the actual lashon. It's an interesting lashon. Let me just see it exactly inside. This has also the hemsh. Oh yeah, Perek Yud Aleph right here. Yeah, so he says this lashon. This one Perek Yud Aleph. K'shani nilchem im harashem ani nikra tzvois. Im kemuv neshem tzvois. V'chein isa b'shari eila Rabbi Yisrael B'tayla. The shem tzvois u b'netzach v'heid u misham nimshachos kol ha-mechomes shebe'elam. I always wondered what does that mean shebe'elam. Does it mean also mechomes between nations? It sounds like it, because what means mechomes shebe'elam? But you could also say it means all the Mochammeds, the Eibishter feared Be'elam. So it doesn't, it's not Negei L'Peil, but it's just interesting. And then he asked the question, what's the Shach Mohammed to Netzach and Heid? This becomes the Yisod of the Perek, and actually the Yisod of the rest of the Hemshech, all the way till the end. Because this, as I said, is a bridge from the first half of the Hemshech to the second half. And what is the bridge? So he says that what is because, why is the Eibishter fear Mohammed? Because Midas HaNetzach. Why would the Eibishter feel Mocham in the first place? So this is the Rishoyim. You can make an argument. Let the Rishoyim be Rishoyim. The Eibishter has to go Mocham to them. Let him deal with his tzaddikim. Rishoyim want to choose bad things. No, but that's not the case. Because when you think about the whole Yesod of Bria Tachas HaBria, and this is from some different Mamorim of the Rebbe, Chafal of a bit, but from other Mamorim, Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baradir B'Tachtein. So that's the root of everything. He wants a dira b'tachtenim. He's not just interested in sitting with tzaddikim in Atzilus. There's no kachlis in that. The Alter Rebbe says, Hayel lehem yiridim me'er panav yizbarach. There's no point in giluyim. He wants dafke tachtenim. That the Alter Rebbe's lashon. The Rebbe elaborates in Tovshin Yud Aleph on that. Tachten shein tachten lematem menach heshach kofel mechupel moli klippers usitra achre at she nemar at she emrim aniva afsi eid. In other words, he wants a world that's exact antithetical, opposite to Lakus in every possible way. That's what Tachtenim means. And Dafka there he wants a Dira. So that inevitably means there has to be a Mochama. Because how do you bridge the two? Here's a Tachtenim that's Shreit Aniva Afsi Eid. The truth is Ein Eid Movade. How are you going to deal with this? So there has to be a Mochama. Mochama Ruchnis, obviously. And this Mochama, therefore, is rooted in what? In the need to have a dira b'tachtenim, which basically that the Eibishter should be menatzeach over l'umazeh, over the Rishoyim. So Midas HaNetzachen is what drives the whole Mochama, that he wants to conquer, not to conquer l'shem conquered, but l'shem dira b'tachtenim. And this Midas HaNetzachen is mushrish, and therefore in the highest levels. Essentially, it's like saying the Kavonas Habriya is mushrish in Atzmus, in the Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu. That's essentially Midas HaNetzach is mushrish in the highest levels in Atzmus. That's just different aces. The Rebbe says it in some of the Maimarim. But it's basically implicit as well. And that's why Tzvois is a Netzach and Heid. Because the Fir Melchama is driven by the Netzach. Netzach. He doesn't explain Heid here. In Tofshin Tes, in the Maimer, Pesach Maimer, he talks about Heid as well as that Arav Heid, the B'derenu, is Netzach and Heid. But here he doesn't address Heid. Only Beremez maybe a little. If you look in Tofshin Tes, he talks about Riches, about Netzach and Heid. But Bekitzer, here the word is Netzachim, to use the Aces here. So, Ma'ashach is the Melchama Netzach v'Heid, Sheyir Misham Netzachim Kol HaMelchama Shebe'elam. So he explains, Inyan HaNetzachim Shayach B'Godel Dafka. And then, at the end of the Pedic, he brings it back and says that B'Shvil Netzuach HaMenagid, that's which is Mushrish in the highest places. So in other words, the whole theme of Basi L'Gani is B'Shachanti B'Seichel, to bring the Shechina to Lamata. Now we understand that to do that, you need a Melchama. Because you have to deal with a shtus delumazeh. You're not dealing with a neutral situation. You're dealing with a menagid. Which is the whole klippas v'sitrachim. So basically transforming the Elam Hazah to Adira b'tachtenim, or to turn a v'shachanti b'seichem, requires a Melchama. It's rooted in the Midas HaNetzachim, which is mushrish all the way in the highest levels. Okay. Now, the thing is, in this Pedic, the Frierdiker Rebbe brings, seemingly, if you think l'cheira, ostensibly, it seems like a Maimer HaMuzgar. Why isn't the gate to know that Tzvois is Shemus from the Sayin Shemus Ein Nimchak? Man of Kamina. You say that Tzvois is fighting a war. That's why the Idn are called Tzivus Hashem. I should have mentioned one more thing. And that's why the Idn, when they went out of Mitzrayim, because they're going to fulfill the Kavona Sabriya through building a Mishkan, after Matan Torah, that's why they're called Tzivus Havaya here. They're not called other names because they're fulfilling this battle. They're the soldiers essentially of Hashem. So they're invoking Shem Tzvois Tzivus Havaya, Tzvois Hashem. They're invoking this Midas HaNetzach through their Melchama, and that's why. Let me just add this final thing I forgot to mention. That's why the Eibush is Mevazbas, the Melech is Mevazbas called Eitzes, that are Kamusim, all these treasures that was completely never revealed to anyone, even in earlier generations. He's mevazes, and not only that, he's mashlich chayev lefanov negdei. He puts himself at risk, as we see when a melech for nitzachim, he will do whatever it takes to win this battle. As he explains that this isn't just the Melchama for Batam B'das, that he's fighting for Shalol Vaz, where he talks about, let's say you want to conquer land, or you want to conquer property, or you want to have the resources. So there you fight a Melchama. No, but that's a Melchama that has Agbola. You fight as much as you need, those resources. Once you have it, when it comes, however, to Netzachin Adover, Midas HaNetzachim, there's no Hagbolas, because the Netzachin is all that matters. And then will be Mavazbas, all the Eitzes, and who is it Mavazbas to the Anshe Chayil, the simple foot soldiers, which is the Tzivus Havaya. And therefore, Tzvois, that's why the name Tzvois, rooted in Netzach, and Netzach is rooted all the way in the highest Madreigas. That's the Nekuda of Pedic Aleph. Afterwards, after Pedic Aleph, he's going to go on to explain what exactly is this Eitzer Ruchnis. I'll mention that soon, but it's not negated to this Pedic directly. Now, so here's the first question that I just posed, which the Rebbe doesn't ask it as a question, Tavshin Chaf Aleph, but he see from the answer. Because L'cheira, what's negay here that Tzvois is shame? What's B'cham negay that the Tzvois is a shame from the Chazayin Shem She'en Nimchak, as he mentions right at the top, right at the beginning of the Pedic. V'shem zen is Gali da Hanavim, and Teda Lein Niska Shem zen. L'cheira, it seems like a Hagdomet to say, so why are we using Tzivus Havaya in Teda? The Rebbe, obviously, in Medayik, and every word from the Frierdiker Rebbe is Meduyik, it's not Stama, Maimer HaMuzar. The Rebbe turns this into a whole Parsha, which is negated to the Havana of the whole Teichen of the Pedic, Yud Aleph, and the Hem HaPrakim. And the Rebbe begins by quoting the Medrash Rabbah that he brings here, the Shemi, at the Mevakers Leidel, Lefi Maisani Nikra. Lefi Maisani Nikra. And the Rebbe says, that just like the Frierdiker Rebbe says, Tzvois has a shtover v'fuche, which is that on one hand, it's a name of the Eibush, the Einim Nechokim, that means it's a name, a holy name, you're not allowed to erase it. On the other hand, it's a name that was Nizgala through the Nevi'im. So the same thing here, Lefi Maisa Ani Nikra, that actual Loshen has a dual meaning. On one hand, it's Maisi. And Maisi, we know, is the lowest levush. It's lower than Machshava and Dibur. It's the Eibishter as he's mislabish in Siyah B'Peil. It definitely does not reflect on Atzmus, and not even the higher levels. It reflects on Maisi, whatever the Maisi is. In this case, Tzvois, Lechem in Milchamas Be'elam with the Rishayim. When you say, Lefi Maisi, Ani Nikra, Ani, however, is Ani Atzmusei. So you have here two extremes. On one hand, Maisim, but it doesn't. The Maisi is attributed to Ani, which is the medrash, of course, the Frierdiker Rebbe brings. So if you read it stam, you could, if you didn't know the Rebbe's Maimer, you read this, you jump right away. Okay, now we go back to Tzvois and Mulchama, and we read on the Maimot. The Rebbe, however, in Tafshir Chafal, that's the Iker, first half of the Maimer, both Friday night and Mitzvah Shabbos. The Iker part of the Maimer was explaining these few lines. Why is it Negei L'Inyanenu? So when you learn Tafshir Chafal is not Muga. So it's Hanocha built in Muga means it's written as the Rebbe said it, which means it could be a lot of things there that were not in Ganzen Izgeteicht. And when you learn it, you right away jump and say, what's the Rebbe's Halal Yichas about Shemus? I mean, what's on the Geya here? So the Rebbe does say the following words. He says, before we get into what Netzach is Mushrish all the way in the highest levels, let's talk about the Shemus. That the Frierdiker Rebbe is starting with the Shemus, and the Rebbe says he wants to explain that the Shemus are Mushrish in a higher level. In other words, to explain Netzach's role, you have to first understand Shemus B'chlal. Because Netzach at the end of the day, its voice is a Shem. It's not Atzmus. When we say Atzmus and Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu, we don't say a name. As a matter of fact, Le Yisram is Le B'Shem, Le B'Shem Eis, Le B'Kates, and so on. We don't refer to a name. A name right away means is a tzir. A high madrega, but it's a tzir. Tzvois is not kale, and kale is not elikim. Elikim is not adnai, etc. It's shayin shemus. So l'cheda, they have the obvious question you're talking about. It's mushrish in the highest levels. On the other hand, lefi maisi means that comes down in particular tzir. How is that explained? And that's the big bulk of the Rebbe's beginning of the Maimer, which is actually the deepest haskalah dikei inyanim in the Maimer. And both, I said again, Mitzvah Shabbos, Friday night and Mitzvah Shabbos, with some shinuyim. So what does the Rebbe say? So the Rebbe brings the whole, to say this dikei, if you ever learn Sheresh Mitzvah Satfila, or other Maimonim, but especially Sheresh Mitzvah Satfila, this is the whole yesod of the big question. Why don't, he brings there in Perek Ches and Sheresh Mitzvah Satfila, I think it's very important to give it as an introduction, even though the Rebbe does not cite the Sheresh Mitzvah Satfila, but it's really, that's the Mamish Da'ozesis. The Rebbe relied that we understand that. He already wrote into, but what does he bring there? The Shals of Shuvas Harivosh, who quotes, he said he asked a Mekubal. Mekubal Dan, what was his name? You have a Derech Mitzvah here? Name of the Muchan, that's Kavaldik. So Perek Ches, I think it just gives it a little body, that's why I'm just mentioning it here. So he says like this. Yet Shayos shows that Kushis Harivaz b'Shavei Siman Kuf Nun Zayin. So he asked there, he addresses if B'Loshen Hanigla, what is this whole thing? B'Shavei, so if he's asking the question, Elu shemechuvonim b'tfilosim b'inyan asfiris. And the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek interestingly writes this lashon: "Mitchilat tzarech ani lahaytik tzas l'sheni." The Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek is telling us he needs to quote the Rivosh. He says, "Pam achas she'alti leila mekubal dan Yosef zal sheshibchem me'ed harivash eich sheyachachem b'talmud chassid gadol eich atem hamukubolim bebracha achas mechuvonim l'sfira yedua or bebracha acheres l'sfira acheres." He goes on to say that what's going on here. There's one Eibishter, Shem Echad, and you be mechaven to different names. Here the kavon is Kael, and here the kavon is Kael Adnai and Avai. All the kavonas, especially in Kisvei Arizal, you see it all over. So he answers, "V'onali chalila shetiat tefila ki'im l'shem yisbarach ilus ha'ilus." And he goes on to explain. The Mekubal is explaining to the Rivash, explaining how it works. He says, "No, obviously there's one Eibishter. But the Eibush has different polas. So, for example, when you need the Eibush, he says, Mamash, I'll just give the moshel, because it helps to understand the Avon and the Rebbe's Maimer very clearly. He says, gives a mosh. So he's going to the Melech, and the Nimshals, the Eibishter, he needs a din Torah, let's say. This is the Bekubal answering the Revosh. So he's going to ask the Melech that I need someone to appoint someone to sit in judgment. I need a Rav, or someone to sit in the Bezdin. He's not going to ask the king to go send the agent to the person who's, let's say, watching all the security guard that watches the king's treasures. That's the mashal he uses. So in other words, the kavanah is not the different, one Eibishter, but we want different things from the Eibishter. When you ask the Eibishter, Reifechelim, you're not asking him Birchas Hashanim, or for other, etc., etc. In other words, each thing, so the kavanah is into the hamshach and not into the mocker. He gives another mashal afterwards as well. That when you want Sarah, you go, if you want Yayin, you ask the Sarah Mashki. You don't go to Sarah Ephraim. You don't go to the baker when you need wine. So we're not talking about the mocker. That's his answer. Then he goes on and he quotes the famous line that Rebbe brings very often, that at the end of the day, like he brings another God. The Rebbe quotes this. He does quote in Basi L'Gani Chapter. The Rebbe doesn't say the name. He just says that God will be Yisrael. The name is Rabbi Shimshon Dekinen. So what did he say? Ani mispal l'daza hatinik. I don't know about all these kavonas, hashemis, and so on. Ani mispal l'daza hatinik, which simply means I'm a chavent boy like a child. A child doesn't know shemis, doesn't know tzviris, doesn't know giluyim. The child's mechaven atzmus and dasidus. Not that the child knows the word asmus, but he means an eibishter, and he doesn't know about a whole seder shtalshtus. The Tzemach Tzedek goes on, and I'm going to go through the whole thing right now to explain. So what is going on here? Why not just mitzpal l'daza hatinuk? So Tzemach Tzedek explains because the Eibishter created a structured world. If the Eibishter just created a tinuk and didn't create us with seichel and midas, then you could just say Kabbalah seil, amuna pshuta, and that's it. That's what tefillah is. But the Eibishter created a mechin and midas, and he wants us to work on ourselves. In other words, he wants adira b'tachtenim b'kol pratim, in every detail. So therefore, how do you mamshech elikus in the details? That's the question. Not how you mamshech at atzmos, period. And that's where all these kavanas and shemas come. So this Perich Aleph, therefore, goes on to explain that the lashon of that he brings from this, the Pardes brings from the Sifri, that it says b'chol karenu alov, a love v'leila midesav, which is essentially the teichener, a love to the Eibishter, not to his midas chaz v'shal. We're not mispal to the Eibishter's midas, whether it's chesed, gvura, teferes. But at the same time, it's lefi maisi ani nikra. So here the Rebbe goes, how do you explain the maisi and the ani? And he brings the three pirushim from the Alter Rebbe said, Yom Kippur Tov Kuf Nun Vav, Mitzvah Yom Kippur, the Alter Rebbe said a Torah, it's brought in Hayem Yem, Yeralef Tishrei, that there's three pirushim, a love Leila Medesav. A love that Ramak teaches, a love is Eres Bekelim. Eres HaMislapshim Bekelim. What we know as being Iyu v'Chayuhi. The Chayuhi, that's Eres. Iyu, you and your Eres are one. So a love Leila Medesav means we're not Mispal Chaz Rishom to the Kelim, the Midas. We're Mispal a love to the Eir Ein Sof, which is Me'ena Moir, and it's just essentially an extension of a love. It's a ha'ara of a love, so we're Mispal to that. Okay. So the Pirush Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe says, is even deeper. Iyu v'garmuhi. We're Mispal, a love means not the Kelim, the Shedish HaKelim. Just like the Eir is Amshach Velakuz. There's another track, which is the Keich HaGvul of Ein Sof, that manifests in the Rishimu that comes after the Tzimtzum, and the Kelim have a Shedish. The Rebbe brings from the Tzemach Tzedek to prove that this is the Pirush Baal Shem Tov, that you can't say the Kelim itself. So what is the Kelim? The Kelim means that he's mispal to the fact that the Eibishter created the Tzir HaElam. So they're going back to the Moshel, let's say, with the Sarah Ephraim and the Yayin. The Eibishter is the root of all Hamshachas. Everything comes from Atzmos. However, he's mamshachet through kavim. There's the kav of chesed, the kav of gvura. They all come from the Eibishter. So the Baal Shem Tov's chiddush is that even in the tzir hadvarim and the keli, a love is the shadish hakeli, meaning the shadish nelakus. And the iyuv v'garmui that the Rebbe says is deeper than iyuv v'chayui, because for elikus to connect to our tzir requires even a deeper level of elikus than elikus that connects to eir, which is not a tzir. Eir is giluyim. And then come the Alter Rebbe then says the third, elov le'emdes is atzmus, nimna hanimnois. The Rebbe in the Maimer of Motzei Shabbos said, Chaz v'sholom, you can't say it's chelik al Rabbi. Alter Rebbe is bringing two pirushim, including the Baal Shem Tov, and then he's coming and saying the pirush haposhet is atzmus ninam nimnois. Elamai, the Rebbe says that's the pirush hapnimi in the Ramak and in the Baal Shem Tov. The Kitzur, the Rebbe says why? Because how can Iyu and Chayui come together? How can Iyu and Garmui come together? You need Keich Atzmus for that. It's very Kitzur, but that's why I refer to Sikha from Tavshim and Beis. You're familiar with that, right? Yutzvah Tavshim and Beis, even though that corresponded to Perikid Beis, the Rebbe has a whole Sikha after the Maimer explaining why the Alter Rebbe is not a stira. Nadarab, the Alter Rebbe is explaining that you need the Ramak and the Baal Shem Tov to understand the Atzmus, and their Kavona is also, the Pirush HaPashut is also the deeper meaning behind the Ramak and the Baal Shem Tov. Why is this so negayah? Let me tell you why. Because as I said before, all this is coming to explain not a Maimer HaMuzgar. This is a Gedoma to understand Midas HaNetzach. Since Midas HaNetzach has to deal with L'Umazeh and Tachtenim, so l'cheire, you could ask the question, what does that have to do with Atzmus? You said it's Musha Shenatzmus. So this Hagdama to explain how the Shemus, our Musha Shenatzmus, actually helps us understand the whole Havana Sainyanim here. Because l'cheire, you could argue that Giluyim, L'Umazeh and Elam Haza Tachten is Takeh the Kavana, but it's not higher. It's not in Giluyim, it's not higher. The whole Seder Shtalshus was given to us in order to make a Dira B'Tachtenim. So b'meila, the whole inyan of what the Ramak teaches and what the what the Baal Shem Tov teaches is really a hagdoma to tell us that it's really the kavana is pirush haposhet of the mispal l'daza hatinuk, that atzmus should be nimshach and tachtenim. But you can't do that, as I said before. We're not a tinuk. You want tachtenim durchnem bepnimi there in the Vesicha Tavshim and Beis. The Rebbe says it's not just a connection to the Eibishter. The Eibishter Mevil has called Ramach Vorim Shasa Gidim. Your whole mitzias should be chadur, durgenum with alakus. And there you have to have eris and kalim for that. Because if you just go, the pshittas of a ish pasha touches pshittas atzmus, that bypasses the whole Seder Shtalshus. You don't need to say the Shtalshus for that. When the child cried, the farm boy cried out kukri ku on Rosh Hashanah, and he was mamshech higher than all the tzaddikim, so the Chayri could ask a question, so why do we daven? We should all cry kukri ku. Or maybe not kukuriku, find something in your heart that's a pasha to cry, and cry to Atzmus. So everyone understands that story is not advocating that everyone should come next year and the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov didn't go and start calling the rooster calls. Because this was a child who didn't know anything. So b'meila, he was able to go straight to the source. But those that do know, obviously you have to find in the tefillah, like he says in Chassidus tefillah, in the pratim, in chesed you want to find the lakus. Atzmus. In Gvura you want to find Atzmus. That's a far harder Aveda. For that Aveda is the Pshittus. And Adrab has a Gavaldi Kamayla. That's why he was able to be Kerei Agzeda, because the farm boy, as the Baal Shem Tov said, reached all the way into Atzmus. But the Kavan is that it should also be in Giluyim. It should do the Chnem and mention. That's the whole union of Chassidus, especially Chassidus Chabad. So interestingly, basically you could say that Ramak and then the Baal Shem Tov leads to that to Atzmus. Eris, Kalim, Atzmus. And Atzmus is Muchrich because the only way to have a Sagdus of Iyu v'chayu Iyu Gamur comes from Atzmus. And vice versa, the only way we, the Tachtenim, can reach Atzmus has to be step by step. In a Chanami, there are times through Tshuva, Yom Kippur, you can have a Diluk. But we know that Veda is B'Seider V'Adroge. If you don't have a Veda B'Seider V'Adroge, it's not going to be B'Primius. So just to have Ladalik Shur, just be able to jump, that's Eisrotz. The Chlal has to be Aveda Al Pitam V'Das, and Aveda Mesuderes. So we have to go through Eris and Kalim and so on. So B'Mela, what do we come away from this? That this Agdom of Shemus is not Stama an interesting subject that he's explaining. It actually, in the Frierdiker Rebbe's few words about Shem Tzvois, and that Lefimaisi Ani Nikra, now we can come back and say, so one of these names is Tzvois, which captures this Etzem Inyan. Remember, every Shem has its Inyan, which captures Amshachas Ha'atzmus and Tachtenim of all the Zayin Shemus, Tzvois, because it deals with the Mulchama, with the Menagid. So Netzach ends up being, essentially, from all the Shemus are rooted in a love, V'leil Midesav, all the way in Atzmus, but Netzach is the one that most mavata this Inyan, because it deals with Vedas. Kale is Amshachas HaChesed. The Eibush says Mamshich Hazonim Mefarnas HaKale, that's Shem Kale. There you don't see so much the battle with Tachtein. Yeah, it's also bitter on the tzutzes, but Shem Tzvois, which is in Netzach, demonstrates most this chibur of Dira B'Tachtein, which is the whole theme of Basi L'Gani. So that is one critical point in the connection between the elements here. You know, if you learn the L'kutei Sichos Chelik Vov, famous Sicha from Tovshin Chav Daled, with Rebbe Taimi Habriya, second Sicha in Shmais. So he talks there about the different reasons. Basically brings three reasons. One is Legalis Shlemus Kechesov, from Samach Vov, Tovshin Beis, and then Yakiru Gdulose, or begin the Yishtamudin Bey, and the third is Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu they did it B'Tachtein. And Bekitza, the Rebbe says that all these times are true. They're in different dargas. Then in Eiris, if you ask the Eir, what's the Kavanah Sabriya? The Eir is in Yoni, is Hamshachas Gili Ha'etzem. The Galish Shlemus Kechesef. It's Gili. It's Gili. But when you, as like he asks in Samach Vav, the Eibster needs to Megalish Shlemus Kechesef, he needs that. So you can't say it's Tachlis Sabriya, it's Tam. It's the Tachlis Hatam. So comes the next reason, Yakiru G'dulasa, that the Kalim should be Makir Elikus. And that too is a Shlemus. So then he goes on, the real reason, the ultimate reason is Asmus. The Sava, Afatayvin is stuck in Kasha. It's not Inyan of Mishlemus Ha, it's not Legal Shlemus Kechesov, it's not Hakoris Ha, Yakiru G'dulasa. It's L'mayla Matam V'das. And what does he say? And how is it in his bat? How is it expressed? Through Shviras HaKlipa, which doesn't have any reason. The Eibishter wants a Shviras HaKlipa. Mamish this word, it's Tzochan HaMelchama. It's L'mayla Matam V'das. The first two reasons has reason. You know, for us, for example, for a human being, we understand, expressing your potential, we call actualizing your potential is a mile. Or that you have the Talmud or the Makabbalah recognizes you. So of course comes the question, so why do we need the first two reasons if you have the third reason? Why do we need the first two? Once the Alter Rebbe is Megalah, Kavanah Sa'atzmus, so the other two. So the Rebbe explains there, but in other sichos, that Gufin is Sava. The Eibishter is Sava, Kodesh Baruch Hu did it b'Tachtenim. He wants that there should also be Eiris and Kalim and a whole Ishtalshul, that they too should understand a Kavanah L'fi Yonam. In other words, he didn't just want a Taiv and Shtok in Kashi. He wanted it to be mislabish as much as possible in our Kalim, that we should also relate to it. That's why you have the other reasons. So the Imam is the same Teichen Advorim here, that helps understand that when you think of it, that the Ramak and the Baal Shem Tov and then comes the Alter Rebbe, because again, you ask the same question. If they love Leilim Desav, ultimately is Atzmos, what do we need the Ramak and the Baal Shem Tov? Why didn't they didn't know that? It was Achidus, the Alter Rebbe, was Machadish. So the answer is because they were talking, like he says, the Rebbe says something very unique. That in the Elam al-Kabbalah, Ramak's Kabbalah is Giluyim. Eiris. Pshach is Giluyim. That's the whole Inyan. It's Inyan of, in English, called transcendence. Areis game for sich. Baal Shem Tov is Chassidus HaKlolis, is the Inyan of Hamshacha, that even in every detail in the world, every leaf is Bashgacha Pratis. Megala, like he says in Shaykh Adamuna, the Chayes Eliki in every prat. So that's Kalim. The Lakus is everywhere. And then comes Atzmus, the Alter Rebbe, so this Chabad, he says, that comes Nimna and Nimnoy, is that you need the combination of Eiris and Kalim. And that is only B'keich Atzmus. So when you come away from that, it's literally, then you bring that into Netzach. So that's it. That's why the Eden are called Sivus Hashem, because they're the one implementing that what the Tachlis Habriya v'Shachanti b'Seicham, the Deir Ashvi that we're doing, is basically after all the Giluyim and Eiris and Kalim is Amshachas Ha'atzmus b'Tachtein. So then takes on a whole different Havana, this whole Teichen Advar. So, what I would add, one more point I would add is, if you learn now the Hemshech HaMaimorim, Hemshech HaProkim rather, what does he say? What's this Eitzer? He's going to say, we'll explain it with the union of Erein Sof L'may Aden Ketz, L'mata Mata Aden Tachlis. So if you think about it, what is the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe coming to add now? He said, Netzach needs Eitzer, the Bizbuz are Eitzers, coming from Atzmus, and we solved the problem. That's why you need it, because that's the whole Kavanah. What's this Erein Sof L'may Aden Ketz, which goes on Prokim after Prokim? So, what's Erein Sof L'may Aden Ketz, L'mata Aden Tachlis? Later he'll say that's the difference between Gilui, Keich HaGilui, and Keich HaHelam. Now, L'mata Aden Tachlis is Keich HaGilui, which means V'atam Achayis Kulam, the Elikus goes down to the lower. Everywhere there's Elikus. That the Gilui Elikus, Bli Gvul of Elikus, it goes everywhere. Essentially, like the word of Eris, that's Ir. And what's Maila Aden Ketz? Helam Acher Helam, Ili Acher Ili. Keich HaHelam in Ein Sof. And then he'll say that's the Eitzer, Keich HaHelam. Because you're going all the way to the highest levels of Etzem. But it's mashma from the Rebbe's Maimorim, and even from the Hemshech in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Basi L'Gani, that both really, especially the chibur of both, is really the Eitzer. Because remember, we don't just want Helam Acher Helam. It's true, the Eitzer is Nelam, but now when the Muhammad comes, Yemavazber is the Eitzer. So it's clearly going to be the Gilead Eitzer. It doesn't remain Behelam. It was Behelam before Tachtein. But once you're fighting with the Menagid and Sitrach in this world, then it's Bizbuz Eitzer. So it's a Gili. So it's Taka Gili of Helam Atzmi, but it's a Gili. So but Pashtus, when you look at the whole picture, it's really essentially the end is that Ebershter, even though L'mayla Aden Ketz, L'mayla Aden Ketz, L'mata Aden Tachlis, but as Chassidus explains in other places, the Rebbe brings it in the later Maimorim, Tavshin Chav Tes, Tavshin Lamed, Tavshin Chav Ches, actually from Chav Zayin through Lamed, the Rebbe brings this more, that essentially, at the end of the day, in Atzmus, there's no L'mayla, no L'mata. It's two Kavim, in Atzmus, it's Yechelas Atzmus, which is one Atzmus. So Nimna Nimnois, that he brings earlier, is actually going to also explain how L'mayla Aden Ketz, L'mata Aden Tachlis come together. That in Tachlis HaTachten, meaning L'mata Mata Aden Tachlis, you have the Gili of L'mayla Aden Ketz, of the Helam, Keich HaHelam HaAtzmi, of the Eitzes. So when you think of the whole Hemshech, then you're saying that Tzochem then becomes a whole another story. It's not just Netzochem, Mushash, and Atzmus, everything comes together. We have L'mayla Aden Ketz, L'mata Aden Tachlis, which of course is a reflection, essentially, if you wish, of Eris and Caleb. Because Caleb comes from Tzad Keich HaHelam, Eir comes from Tzad Keich HaGili, the Ramak and the Baal Shem Tov in the reverse order, and then a love Leila Medes of Keich HaAtzmus, which connects it all together. So this is somewhat of a overview, and everything Ma'aser B'Peil means that you and I, whether we like it or not, like the Rebbe said in the Basi L'Gani Chapter 70 years ago, we are the Deir HaShvi, we are the Chayolim, simple soldiers, so we have the power to literally achieve anything we set our minds to with the keiches that we have, the bizbuz, the eitzes, the highest eitzes that were not given like Avesenu, like he says, all the generations, no one had this type of keiches. So I think it's important to recognize what we are, was mir farmogen in Yiddish, what we carry, what we contain, and hopefully we can do something with it even before Yud Shvat, and maybe finish the job that Rebbe gave us 30 years ago, 70 years ago, to turn tut Alzvus Kent, to bring the Shechina Lamata, Shchanti B'Seichem, like the Rebbe concludes, Basi L'Gani, Yud Aleph, B'Niske Zenzich Mit Rebbe Dalamata, Asarat Tfochem, Shoma B'Guf. Okay.
How does it fit like mentioning about that choice?